At my daughter Kate's wedding, she looked me in the eye and whispered, "You're not my family anymore." I remained silent. But when she stood before 200 wealthy guests and called another man her real father, she sealed her fate. She thought my $40,000 in life savings had paid for her perfect day. She had no idea that just 2 hours later, the consequences of her wedding would become unstoppable. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. But before all that, before the chaos and the tears, there was only the quiet weight of my sacrifice. $25,000. My entire pension savings folded neatly inside a crisp, white envelope. It pressed against my chest pocket, a constant, heavy reminder of what this day was costing me. The parking lot at the Oak Haven Country Club stretched before me, a glittering sea of wealth that made my 15-year-old Ford look like a forgotten relic from another century. Mercedes, BMW, Lexus, cars that cost more than I had made in 2 years at the factory. Their polished hoods gleamed under the soft glow of the late afternoon sun, each one a silent testament to a world I did not belong to. I sat behind the worn steering wheel, my hands gripping it tightly, watching elegantly dressed guests glide toward the grand entrance of the clubhouse. The women wore designer dresses in jewel tones, their laughter carrying on the gentle breeze. The men were clad in tailored suits that probably cost what I spent on groceries for 6 months. My own suit, the best I owned, suddenly felt cheap and ill-fitting. The fabric seemed coarse, the cut clumsy, the envelope in my pocket crinkled as I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. 6 months. 6 months of 60-hour work weeks before I finally retired. 6 months of skipped meals and canceled plans with the few friends I had left. All of it for this single moment. Kate's wedding day. My little girl's special day. Except she wasn't little anymore. 28 years old, a successful marketing career, and marrying into a level of wealth I could never have provided. The Sterling family practically owned half of Boston's historic district. Richard Sterling, her future father-in-law, could probably buy my entire neighborhood without even checking his bank balance. But I was her father. I had raised her. Surely, that had to count for something. Taking one deep, shaky breath, I turned off the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. It was time. Straightening my tie one last time in the rearview mirror, I stepped out of the car. The March air carried the scent of expensive flowers, lilies, and roses, I guessed, and the faint, elegant sound of string music drifted from the manor's gardens. Other guests moved past me with a practiced ease, their confident strides and low, cultured murmurs marking them as members of this privileged world. I followed at a distance, the single, uncomfortable thought echoing in my mind. Imposter. The clubhouse entrance gleamed with crystal chandeliers visible through tall, arched windows. Valets in crisp burgundy uniforms directed the flow of luxury vehicles with silent efficiency. Everything sparkled with the kind of deliberate elegance that money could buy, the money I had sacrificed to give Kate the wedding she dreamed of. "Artie, over here." I turned, my heart lifting at the sound of a familiar, grounded voice. Frank was standing by a large potted fern, looking just as out of place as I felt. His off-the-rack suit was neat, but it couldn't hide the decades of honest labor etched into his hands and face. He was the only person I had invited. "Frank, I'm glad you could make it," I said, my handshake firm and genuine. It was the first real thing I had felt all day. He clapped me on the shoulder. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." "But wow," he whistled softly, looking around the grand hall. "This is a whole other planet, ain't it? Don't let these folks get to you, Artie. You're the one who made all this happen, remember that." Before I could respond, a smooth voice cut in. "Arthur, my friend." Richard Sterling approached with the confident stride of a man accustomed to command. He was tall, silver-haired, and wore a suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment used to be. His wife, Helen, glided beside him, her smile perfectly practiced, her navy blue dress the picture of understated elegance. "Richard." "Helen," I nodded, forcing a polite smile. Richard's handshake was firm, but his eyes were empty. "How's life treating you in retirement?" Must be quite an adjustment from the factory floor. The words were like tiny, sharp needles. Factory floor, not factory work, not engineering. as if I had spent 30 years pushing a broom instead of designing manufacturing systems that saved companies like his millions. It's been good, I managed. Congratulations on gaining such a wonderful daughter. Oh, we're the lucky ones, Helen chimed in, her voice as sweet as honey but with an underlying layer of steel. Richard, look how sweet. Our new daughter has such a hard-working father. Hard-working. Another diminishing word, reducing 3 decades of skilled labor to simple muscle and sweat. Frank shifted beside me, clearly uncomfortable. Well, we must go mingle. So glad you made it, Richard said, his gaze sweeping over my suit one last time before dismissing me. They turned away, their backs straight and proud. Frank let out a low breath. Wow, those two are a piece of work. I could only nod, the warmth from seeing my friend draining away, replaced by a familiar cold sting. And it was then that I saw her, Kate. She stood in a nearby doorway, radiant in her wedding dress, silk and lace transforming her into something ethereal. For a heartbeat, the world fell away. She was no longer a 28-year-old woman in a $3,000 dress. She was just Kate. My Kate, the little girl with scraped knees who used to run into my arms after school, her face sticky with cotton candy from the county fair. My throat tightened. A wave of fatherly pride, so powerful it almost brought me to my knees, washed over me. Sweetheart, I started, taking a step toward her, my arms ready for an embrace. You look. Oh, you actually came, she said. Her voice carried no warmth, no joy, just a mild, detached surprise, as if my presence was unexpected and slightly inconvenient. Before I could process the sting of her words, she'd already turned away. Richard, Helen. Her voice brightened instantly, becoming musical and loving. Come meet come over here. She caught herself, a brief flicker of awkwardness before she smoothed it over with a brilliant smile. The photographer, a young man with professional energy, clapped his hands. All right, everyone, let's start with the immediate family, please. Bride and groom, parents. Right here by the fireplace. I stood a little straighter, smoothing my suit jacket. This was it. The moment of formal recognition, captured forever in wedding photographs that would hang in their home for generations. I prepared to take my rightful place beside my daughter. Kate smiled brilliantly as Richard and Helen flanked her sides. Her new husband, Spencer, took his position with practiced ease. The Sterling family formed a perfect, shimmering circle around her, a portrait of success and belonging. I approached the group, my heart beating a little faster with anticipation. Perfect lighting here. This is going to be beautiful, the photographer said, looking through his lens. He looked up with a welcoming smile. Everyone ready? Let's capture this family moment. As I moved to stand next to Kate, her voice cut through the air like ice. Actually, she said, not looking at the camera, but at me, I need to clarify something. She turned, her expression shifting from radiant bride to something colder, more distant. The transformation was so sudden, I thought I'd imagined it. Dad, she said, the word now just a label, devoid of affection. I'm sorry, but you're not part of this photo. You aren't my family anymore. Her voice was clear and steady, carrying across the space to every guest within earshot. She then gestured to the impeccably dressed people beside her. These are my real family members now. The world shifted beneath my feet. Not metaphorically, but literally. The marble floor seemed to tilt. The crystal chandeliers blurred into a spinning kaleidoscope of light and pain. 28 years of bedtime stories, school plays, graduations and dreams, all erased with a single sentence, declared null and void in front of strangers in $1,000 suits. The photographer lowered his camera, his face a mask of discomfort. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd. I felt their eyes on me, pitying, curious, embarrassed. I understand. The words came from somewhere deep inside me, forced through a throat that felt crushed. Enjoy your photos. I turned away from the group, from my daughter, from the life I thought we had built. Each step felt like walking through quicksand. I retreated to my assigned table in the corner, watching numbly as Richard Sterling proudly placed his hand on my daughter's shoulder, taking the spot that should have been mine. Behind me, I could hear the clicking of the camera, the gentle directions the photographer gave to pose the Sterling family around my daughter. Their laughter carried across the space, warm, inclusive, and painfully complete without me. Beautiful. Now, Kate, tilt slightly toward Richard. Perfect. Helen, can you move just a step closer? Excellent. Each click of the shutter was another moment captured that I would never be a part of, another memory that would officially record my erasure. I stared at my hands, resting on the white tablecloth. They were weathered from 30 years of honest work, scarred from countless small injuries earned while providing for the very daughter who had just declared me irrelevant. These hands had built her first dollhouse, taught her how to tie her shoes, and signed every check for her education. Now, they trembled slightly as the full weight of her rejection settled deep into my bones. The photography session finally ended, and the reception began. A 12-piece orchestra struck up a classical melody that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. Servers in crisp uniforms began circulating with silver trays of appetizers that probably cost more per piece than I spent on lunch for a week. I remained at my corner table, a silent observer of my own financial investment. Ladies and gentlemen, the bandleader's smooth voice boomed through the microphone. And now, for a cherished tradition, we would like to invite the bride and her father to the dance floor for the father-daughter dance. For a foolish, hopeful second, my heart skipped a beat. Could this be it? A mistake? A moment of reconciliation? I half rose from my seat, my eyes searching for Kate. I found her instantly. She was gliding onto the dance floor, her hand placed elegantly not in mine, but in Richard Sterling's. He led her to the center of the room with a proprietary smile, placing one hand on her waist as the orchestra began to play a soft, sentimental tune. The room faded away. All I could see was them. He spun her gracefully, her expensive wedding dress flowing like cream around them. She laughed at something he whispered in her ear, a sound so bright and genuinely happy it felt like a physical blow. It was the way she used to laugh with me, when she was small, before she learned that the laughter of a working-class father wasn't sophisticated enough for her new aspirations. I remembered dancing with her in our small living room, her tiny feet on top of mine, as we swayed to an old record player. She had been so small, her world so simple, her love had been so unconditional. Where had that girl gone? The man dancing with my daughter now was a stranger to her childhood, a man who hadn't been there for the fevers, the scraped knees, or the tearful heartbreaks. Yet, she looked at him with an adoration I hadn't seen in her eyes for years. The dance was a performance, a public declaration that the transfer of loyalty was complete. He was her father now. I was just a spectator. The song ended, and the guests erupted in enthusiastic applause. Kate hugged Richard tightly, a gesture of deep affection. The moment was perfect, a beautiful memory being forged for her new life. A memory built on the ashes of mine. As they walked off the floor, not once did she glance in my direction. It was then I realized I wasn't just being ignored. I was completely invisible. The reception continued with clockwork precision. Servers presented the first course, some kind of herb-crusted salmon, I remembered from the menu selection. $47 per plate, multiplied by 200 guests. Another small fortune carved from my pension, served on china that cost more than my monthly car payment. I moved the expensive food around my plate, unable to taste a thing. Around me, guests exclaimed over the quality of the food and the elegance of the celebration. They understood that someone had paid dearly for this luxury. They simply, incorrectly, assumed that someone was happy to do so. After the main course, Helen Sterling rose from her chair, moving toward the microphone with the confidence of someone accustomed to public speaking. The crowd quieted expectantly. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the decorated space, "I'd like to say a few words about our beautiful new daughter. Our daughter. Not Arthur's daughter who was marrying into their family. Our daughter, as if Kate had been born into the Sterling clan." I set down my fork, my appetite completely gone. Helen's speech was brief and polished, full of praise for Kate's charm and ambition. Then, with maternal pride, she handed the microphone to my daughter. Kate rose gracefully, her champagne flute catching the light like a crystal beacon. 200 pairs of eyes turned to the radiant bride. For one last, desperate moment, hope flickered in my chest. Perhaps this was it. The traditional daughter's speech, where she would finally thank her father for his love, his sacrifices, his unwavering support through 28 years of devoted parenthood. "Thank you all for sharing this perfect day with us," Kate began, her voice confident and musical. "I want to recognize the most important people who made this possible." She paused, scanning the crowd with practiced poise. Her eyes swept past my table without a hint of acknowledgement, landing instead on Richard and Helen at the head table. My grip tightened on my water glass. "Richard," she said, her voice filled with a deep, convincing emotion, "you became the real father I always needed, the one who showed me what true paternal love should look like." Gentle, polite laughter rippled through the crowd. Understanding chuckles from guests who thought they were witnessing charming honesty rather than calculated cruelty. My world collapsed into that single phrase. Real father. 28 years of bedtime stories reduced to a punchline. Decades of overtime shifts transformed into a comedic failure. Every sacrifice I had ever made, dismissed with casual laughter from strangers drinking champagne purchased with my life savings. Richard stood slowly, accepting the microphone with dignified grace. "My dear daughter," he said, the word daughter rolling off his tongue like a claim of ownership. "It has been my honor to guide you. You needed a father who truly understands your worth." More applause. Enthusiastic approval. The message was clear. Working-class devotion couldn't compete with country club cultivation. I stood up quietly. My movement was barely noticed amid the continuing toasts and congratulations. No dramatic exit. No angry confrontation. Just a man in his best suit, slipping away from a party that had transformed his love into a source of public entertainment. I walked toward the heavy double doors, my steps steady and sure. The pain in my chest was still there, but it was beginning to cool, hardening into something else. Something solid, something like resolve. I walked out of the reception hall, the applause behind me like a final judgment on my 28 years of fatherhood. The cool night air hit my face as the heavy clubhouse doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the sound of celebration like a heavy curtain. The sudden silence was a relief. Streetlights illuminated the parking lot, and the luxury vehicles sat gleaming in neat rows, their polished surfaces reflecting my solitary figure back at me through expensive chrome. My Ford waited in the far corner, humble and functional among its prestigious neighbors. I walked toward it slowly, my footsteps the only sound in the suddenly peaceful evening. No applause, no laughter, no speeches declaring my obsolescence. Just the distant hum of traffic on the interstate, and the frantic beating of my own wounded heart. Reaching my car, I leaned against the driver's side door, my legs feeling weak. With trembling fingers, I pulled out my wallet. The leather had grown soft with age, worn smooth by decades of honest work. Behind my license, tucked carefully in the plastic photo sleeve, was a picture I had carried for 18 years. It was Kate, at 10 years old, missing her 2 front teeth, her arms wrapped around my neck in a fierce, loving embrace. We had been at the county fair, her face sticky with cotton candy, her eyes bright with an uncomplicated joy that money could never buy. She had won a stuffed elephant at the ring toss and declared me the best daddy in the whole world before falling asleep in my arms on the drive home. "Daddy, promise you'll always be there for me," she had whispered that night as I tucked her into bed. "Promise you'll never leave me like Mommy did." My throat tightened as I stared at that innocent face, trying to reconcile it with the woman who had just publicly divorced me in front of 200 strangers. When had that trusting child transformed into someone capable of such calculated cruelty? The answer came with unwelcome clarity. It had happened gradually, methodically, over the 2 years since she had met the Sterlings. Small changes I had rationalized as her just maturing. Her embarrassment when I picked her up in my aging Ford. Her gentle corrections of my grammar. Her requests for money for etiquette classes and expensive clothes so she could fit in with her new friends. I had enabled every transformation, worked extra shifts to fund the gradual erasure of everything that connected her to me, to her past. "She would have set boundaries, Susan," I whispered to the photograph, my voice thick with emotion as I thought of my late wife. "You would have stopped this before it started." But Susan had been gone for 15 years, and in my grief, I had raised Kate with endless generosity instead of necessary guidance. Every time she pushed against her background, I had smoothed the way forward instead of teaching her to value where she came from. Looking up at the stars, barely visible through the city's glow, I felt a shift inside me. It felt like awakening from a long, painful dream. Susan had trusted me to protect our daughter. But protection didn't just mean giving her everything she wanted. Sometimes it meant teaching consequences. A firm resolve, cold and clear, formed in the pit of my stomach. The little girl who had called me the best daddy in the whole world was gone, replaced by a woman who valued social status more than parental devotion, but I was still here. I was still capable of teaching one final lesson about respect. My hand moved to my shirt pocket, where the envelope waited, heavy with possibility. Under the streetlight's harsh glow, I pulled it out and extracted the check with a slow, ceremonial precision. $25,000, written in my own careful handwriting. I had signed it with the same pen I'd used to sign her report cards and permission slips for field trips to museums she now navigated as a sophisticated adult. The paper felt substantial between my fingers, real in a way that emotions sometimes weren't. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or wounded pride. This was 6 months of 60-hour weeks, condensed into a single piece of paper that could transform a celebration into a catastrophe. I studied my own signature, remembering the moment I'd signed it 3 weeks ago. I'd felt proud then, sacrificial in the way a father should be when giving his daughter her dreams. Now, that signature looked like evidence of my own foolishness, documentation of how thoroughly I'd been played. The mathematics of it were ruthless in their clarity. 12,000 for catering that would feed people who'd laughed at my inadequacy. 3,000 for flowers that would wilt tomorrow, while my humiliation lived forever in professional photographs. 4,000 for music that had provided the soundtrack to my own replacement ceremony. Each expense had seemed reasonable when I imagined walking my daughter down the aisle. Instead, I'd funded my own funeral as her father, complete with eulogies delivered by her new family. "She wants to treat me like a stranger," I said quietly to the cold March air. "Then I'll act like one." The decision crystallized with a surprising sense of peace. No anger, no desire for revenge. Just the simple, clean logic of cause and effect. Kate had chosen to publicly sever our relationship. I was merely honoring her choice by implementing its natural consequences. With deliberate precision, I tore the check in half. The sound of ripping paper was crisp and satisfying in its finality. One piece went into my left pocket, the other into my right. A commitment device. It was done. The liberation was immediate and overwhelming. For the first time in months, the heavy weight was gone from my chest. I wasn't carrying someone else's expectations anymore. No daughter to impress. No in-laws to satisfy. No social obligations to fulfill with money I couldn't afford to spend. I straightened my tie and smoothed my jacket, composing myself. This was education. The final lesson in a curriculum I'd started 28 years ago. Walking back toward the restaurant entrance, I felt calmer than I had all day. Let them demonstrate their commitment to their real daughter when the bill came due. The torn pieces of the check rested in my pockets, a secret that would soon become the most expensive lesson in respect that money could buy. I took one deep breath before re-entering the world I was about to revolutionize. The heavy doors swung closed behind me with a muffled finality, sealing out the cool evening air and returning me to the warm, humming bubble of celebration. The crystal chandeliers cast the same golden light. The orchestra played the same elegant melodies. The guests continued their animated conversations over champagne. Nothing in the scenery had changed, but the observer had. I walked through the reception hall with measured steps, my posture straight, my gaze steady. I was no longer the anxious, invisible father seeking a scrap of approval. The torn pieces of the check in my pockets felt like anchors, grounding me in my newfound resolve. Each guest I passed, each flower arrangement I noticed, each note from the 12-piece orchestra now represented money that would soon become someone else's problem. My table waited exactly as I'd left it, the untouched champagne flute still reflecting the light from above. I sat down slowly, arranged my napkin on my lap with deliberate care, and began to watch the performance with new eyes. Kate was near the center of the room, dancing with her bridesmaids. Her laughter was bright and musical as she gestured toward the elaborate floral displays. "Look at this venue. Spencer spared no expense for our special day, she told her maid of honor, spinning in her $3,000 dress. She then added with a dismissive wave of her hand, "Well, technically, Daddy paid for everything, but Spencer and the Sterlings chose all the beautiful details. Technically, Daddy paid. As if my 6 months of overtime, my entire future security, was just a minor technicality in their grand romantic story." At the head table, Spencer clinked glasses with his father, both men wearing the satisfied expressions of successful negotiators. I overheard Spencer confide to a cousin, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "It's wonderful when simple people understand their place in supporting better things." Simple people. The phrase rolled off his tongue with a casual contempt, as if factory workers like me existed purely to fund the dreams of our social superiors. I gripped my water glass tightly, feeling the torn paper rustle in my pocket, a quiet promise of the lesson to come. Across the room, the venue manager, a sharp-looking man named Antonio, moved between tables with professional efficiency. He was checking on details, coordinating service with his staff. Occasionally, his eyes swept toward my table, not with suspicion, but with the natural timing of a businessman who understood reception schedules. The time for payment was approaching, as inevitable as gravity. I straightened my tie, preparing for the final act. 28 years of fatherhood had taught me patience and sacrifice. Tonight, I would teach my daughter about consequences. The orchestra struck up another waltz. In just a few more minutes, perfection would meet reality, and I would be there to watch. The manager, Antonio, caught my eye from across the room. He gave a slight professional nod and began to weave his way through the tables, a leather folder in his hand. He was coming for me. "Mr. Morgan." "Excuse the interruption." Antonio's voice was the epitome of professional courtesy, yet it cut through the low hum of the party. He placed the leather folder on my table with practiced precision. "It's time for the reception payment settlement. Here is the final itemized bill." I opened the folder slowly. The numbers stared back at me, figures I had memorized weeks ago. Catering, $12,000. Venue rental, $4,000. Floral arrangements, $3,000. Each line item was an hour of my life, a weekend sacrificed, a small comfort denied. The grand total sat at the bottom in bold type, $25,000. Just then, Kate glided over from the dance floor, Spencer following at a respectful distance. Her face carried the confident glow of someone who had never doubted the outcome of any financial negotiation in her life. She saw the open folder and smiled, a casual, dismissive smile. "Dad, you know our arrangement," she said, her tone almost bored, as if she were reminding me to leave a tip for the valet. "Time to settle up for the celebration. Everything looks perfect, doesn't it?" She gestured around the decorated hall with a proprietary satisfaction, her expensive dress catching the light from the crystal chandeliers I had paid to illuminate. Behind her, Spencer nodded encouragingly, his relief at avoiding financial responsibility written clearly across his handsome face. I closed the folder with a soft, final thud. I looked up, past the expectant face of the manager, and met my daughter's eyes. The transformation was complete. I was no longer her father. I was a walking, talking ATM, valued only for what I could provide. "I've changed my mind, Kate." The words were quiet, but they fell into the surrounding chatter like stones into still water. Her confident smile flickered, a momentary confusion passing through her eyes, but it didn't disappear. She clearly thought I was making some kind of joke. "What are you talking about?" She laughed, a brittle sound. "Don't be dramatic. Everyone is watching." "I am being perfectly clear," I continued, my voice steady and measured, allowing each word to land with its full weight. I stood slowly, so we were at eye level. "Today I learned exactly who you are, and I have a very simple policy." I paused, letting the silence stretch. "I don't pay for strangers' parties." The smile vanished from her face. The color drained from her cheeks as the impossible meaning of my words finally hit her. Spencer took a half-step forward, his own face pale with dawning comprehension. "Sir, let's be reasonable about this," he stammered. But I wasn't looking at him. I was looking at my daughter, watching the disbelief in her eyes curdle into shock, then into the first stirrings of panic. Catherine's face turned ashen as she realized I was not joking. Her entire perfect world was starting to fracture right before her eyes. The silence at our table was a vacuum, pulling in the attention of the surrounding guests. Conversations quieted as people sensed the unfolding drama. Antonio, the manager, stood his ground, his expression firm but patient. He had seen family disputes before. Kate's shock finally gave way to a surge of frantic energy. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, her voice a low, trembling whisper. "He's just being emotional. I'll handle this." She grabbed Spencer's arm, her knuckles white. "Come on." She didn't run, but she walked with a speed and purpose that betrayed her panic, her heels clicking rapidly against the marble floor as she headed straight for the head table. I remained standing, watching the experiment unfold. I had set the pieces in motion. Now I would observe the results. Richard and Helen Sterling looked up as their new daughter-in-law approached, their patrician features showing mild concern at her obvious distress. "There's been a misunderstanding with my father," Kate began, her voice carefully controlled despite the panic I could see building behind her eyes. "He's having second thoughts about the payment arrangement. Something about feeling unappreciated." She forced a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "You know how older people can get. I'm sure we can work it out, but in the meantime—" She paused, clearly struggling with words she never imagined she'd have to say. Could you help us with the reception payment? Just temporarily, until we sort out this silly confusion?" Richard's expression shifted, an almost imperceptible change, but the generous patriarch was gone, replaced in an instant by a calculating businessman. He didn't look at Kate, he looked at his son. "Well, Spencer," he said, his tone smooth as polished wood, "we have already committed quite substantially to your honeymoon arrangements. The first-class European tour, the 5-star accommodations. Finances are rather tight at the moment." Helen nodded sympathetically, but her tone carried steel beneath the sweetness. "Of course we want to support you both, dear ones," she said, patting Spencer's arm. "But supporting you doesn't mean paying for your obligations. That's not how real families operate, is it?" The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. Real families. The very words Kate had used to discard me were now being used as a shield to abandon her. Spencer's face flushed with embarrassment. "But you said, you welcomed us. Families help each other in a crisis." "And we are family, darling boy," Helen replied, her smile never faltering. "But we are not an automatic source of funding. Competent adults are expected to manage their own responsibilities." I watched Kate's face crumble as her new family revealed their true nature under the first sign of financial pressure. The loving, generous people who had embraced her so warmly were now showing their carefully hidden selfishness with surgical precision. They had welcomed a social asset, not a daughter with problems. She had traded unconditional love for conditional acceptance, and the conditions had just been violated. In their world, a financial liability was not family. Desperate and abandoned, Kate's eyes darted around the room, searching for another way out. Her face, once a mask of confident radiance, was now pale and tight with panic. Her eyes, wide with desperation, darted around the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Then, her gaze landed on the elegantly decorated gift table in the corner, where envelopes and wrapped packages sat in a careful, pristine arrangement. A final, desperate idea sparked in her mind. "Quick, the gift table," Kate whispered urgently to Spencer, abandoning all pretense of diplomacy for raw pragmatism. "We need to open the envelopes. Count everything. Maybe there's enough to cover at least part of it." Spencer, looking miserable and utterly out of his depth, nodded numbly. He followed her to the table. Under the curious and increasingly uncomfortable stares of their nearby guests, they began the humiliating process of tearing open their own wedding gifts. Her perfect manicure, which had cost $100, smudged as she ripped open a delicate envelope. "This one's from your coworkers," Spencer muttered, extracting a few bills. $200. She snatched the money and moved to the next. "My cousin Sarah, $150. Great Aunt Martha," he read from a card, his voice hollow, $50 and a note about finding happiness in simple things. The irony was lost on them. They were no longer bride and groom celebrating well wishes. They were frantic accountants auditing their own party, reducing loving sentiments to mere currency that was falling perpetually, hopelessly short of their desperate need. 50 here, 100 there, occasionally a more generous 200 or 300 from closer relatives. Kate's hands shook as she calculated a running total, her perfect bridal composure disintegrating with each opened envelope. "How much so far?" she asked, her voice tight with suppressed panic. "Maybe 4,000, Spencer replied quietly, his accounting background lending an unwanted precision to their public humiliation. "5 at most. Enough for the photographer and the band, maybe. But the catering and the venue." He didn't need to finish the sentence. The math was brutal. Even with every last envelope opened and every gift monetized, they were facing a shortfall so massive it was insurmountable. They had paid off the smaller debts, watching their precious pile of cash shrink with each transaction, while the main bill from the venue remained untouched, immovable, a financial boulder blocking their path. The pile of torn envelopes and discarded cards grew around them like the wreckage of their perfect day. The small pile of cash in Kate's hand was a testament to the generosity of their friends and family, but it was also a stark, cruel symbol of their failure. It wasn't nearly enough. Antonio, the manager, approached their makeshift counting station, his professional patience beginning to show visible strain. The courteous smile was gone, replaced by a firm, unyielding line. He checked his watch with a practiced motion. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice low but clear, "I don't mean to pressure you, but we do have other events scheduled. My evening staff is waiting to complete cleanup, and we need to settle accounts this evening as per our contract." Kate looked up from her pathetic pile of remaining bills, her face pale with the realization that even their best efforts had failed. We're still short." "Quite a bit," she stammered. "Maybe we could arrange payments? A schedule? Something manageable?" "My contract specifies full payment upon service completion," Antonio replied, his voice firm but not unkind. It was simply a statement of fact. $12,000 was the agreed-upon amount for catering. I provided the agreed-upon service. I require the agreed-upon payment. Seeing the blank, helpless look on their faces, and realizing this private negotiation was going nowhere, Antonio made a decision. He took a half-step back from their table, straightened his tie, and raised his voice, not shouting, but projecting it with enough authority to command the entire room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this interruption." The orchestra stopped mid-song. Conversations died instantly. 200 faces, a sea of confusion and curiosity, turned toward the drama unfolding around the gift table. The elegant bubble of celebration had burst. "I have a business matter that requires immediate resolution," Antonio announced with a professional clarity that made privacy impossible. "Mrs. Sterling currently owes $12,000 for catering services provided this evening. If this matter isn't resolved within the next 10 minutes, he paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, "I will be contacting my security service for debt collection procedures." Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the grand hall. Guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, shifting in their seats as they realized they were witnessing something far beyond typical wedding drama. This was public humiliation, complete with specific dollar amounts and an official ultimatum. The air crackled with a tension so thick you could feel it on your skin. All eyes were on my daughter, the beautiful bride, now trapped in the center of her own disastrous creation. 10 minutes. The clock was ticking. The 10-minute countdown hung in the air, each silent second stretching into an eternity. Kate's composure, already fractured, shattered like expensive crystal hitting a marble floor. Her face, blotchy and pale beneath the perfect makeup, contorted in a mask of disbelief and fury. "Dad!" The word exploded from her throat, no longer a title of endearment, but a raw, wounded accusation. It was so loud it seemed to rattle the chandelier crystals. "You're destroying me! This is your fault. You've ruined the most important day of my life." Her voice cracked on the final words. Tears, real and hot, streamed down her cheeks, carving paths through her foundation. The perfect bride had vanished, replaced by a hysteric in white silk, screaming at her father while 200 witnesses watched in horrified fascination. "I've never seen anything like this," someone whispered at a nearby table, their shock evident despite their attempt at discretion. Spencer grabbed his wife's shoulders, his own face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and panic. Kate, please, calm down. Everyone is staring. I don't care who's looking, she shrieked, shoving his hands away with a strength I didn't know she possessed. Let them all know. Let them see what kind of selfish, cruel father abandons his own daughter on her wedding day. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her entire body shaking as she turned to address the room like a prosecutor delivering her closing arguments. This man, she sobbed, this man raised me for 28 years, only to humiliate me when I needed him most. He promised to pay for everything, then changed his mind because his precious feelings got hurt. What kind of father does that? The room remained frozen in uncomfortable silence. The guests were trapped, caught between a natural sympathy for a crying bride and the dawning recognition that something far more complex was unfolding here. I stood slowly, straightening my tie with deliberate calm. The chaos swirled around me, but inside, I was perfectly still. When I spoke, my voice wasn't loud, but it carried the measured authority of a man who had made peace with a difficult decision. Now you understand what real consequences feel like, Kate. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair, preparing for my final departure. You declared me irrelevant, I said, looking her directly in the eye for the last time. I'm simply honoring your wishes. You can't do this to me. Her voice broke, hysteria giving way to a childlike desperation as the full weight of her situation crashed down upon her. I have nowhere else to go, no one else to ask. Perhaps your real family will help, I replied quietly, letting the phrase hang in the air like an unresolved final note before I turned my back on her for good. I did not look back. Walking toward the exit, I could hear Kate's sobs echoing off the high, ornate ceilings. They were ragged, desperate sounds, the cries of someone whose perfectly constructed world had just been demolished. I could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on my back, a mixture of shock, confusion, and perhaps, in some, a flicker of understanding. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Richard and Helen Sterling. They remained conspicuously seated at their table, studying their champagne flutes with a sudden, intense interest, making no move to intervene or assist the real daughter they had so proudly claimed just an hour before. In their world, a public scene was a contagion to be avoided, not a crisis to be solved. My footsteps were steady on the marble floor. Each one felt lighter than the last. With every step, I was walking further away from 28 years of one-sided devotion, and closer to a future defined by self-respect, rather than endless, thankless giving. I reached the heavy, polished oak doors and pushed. The cool night air rushed to meet me, a clean, welcome embrace. The doors swung shut behind me with a soft, heavy thud, muffling the sound of Kate's continuing breakdown until it was nothing more than a faint, distant echo. And then, silence. I stood on the stone steps of the clubhouse for a long moment, simply breathing. The elegant facade of the Oakhaven Country Club now contained the ruins of a perfect celebration, a prison of Kate's own making. I walked across the now mostly empty parking lot toward my Ford. The reliable old car, which had seemed like a symbol of my working-class failure just hours ago, now looked like a chariot of freedom. It had never seemed more welcoming than it did in this moment of my complete transformation. The reliable rumble of the engine starting was a comforting, familiar sound. It was the sound of honesty, of faithfulness, of a life that had never pretended to be anything it wasn't. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I took one last look at the grand clubhouse in my rearview mirror, its golden windows glowing against the dark sky. Then, I turned onto the road and drove toward home, not looking back again. The drive home took me through neighborhoods I had navigated thousands of times, but tonight they looked different. The glow of the streetlights seemed warmer, the quiet suburban houses more peaceful. It wasn't the scenery that had changed. It was the man behind the wheel. The man who had driven this route just hours earlier was gone, replaced by someone lighter, freer. My modest house waited for me, a simple two-bedroom structure that had once seemed almost shabby compared to the places Kate frequented. But as I pulled into my own driveway, I saw it differently. It wasn't a working-class limitation. It was a sanctuary. It was a place free from people who measured a man's worth by the price tag on his suit. It was home. Inside, everything remained exactly as I'd left it that afternoon. My comfortable reading chair, the photographs of genuinely happy moments on the mantelpiece, the quiet hum of the old refrigerator. The house felt peaceful in a way I hadn't appreciated before tonight's stark contrast with expensive anxiety. Susan's photograph sat in its usual place, her smile captured during a camping trip years ago. I picked up the frame, my hand steady now. "I know you'd have handled this better, Susan," I said softly to her smiling face. "You'd have set boundaries years ago. But I think you'd be proud of what I did tonight." She chose her path. I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a feeling that I had finally honored not only myself, but her memory as well. I settled into my favorite armchair, the tension of the long evening finally draining from my shoulders. For the first time in months, I wasn't worried about someone else's expectations. No daughter requiring a financial rescue, no in-laws demanding a social performance. Tomorrow, I would wake up with $25,000 still in my bank account, money that was no longer a sacrifice for someone else's approval, but a tool for my own future. My future. I could travel, if I wanted. I could finally fix up the old boat I had sitting in the garage. I could pursue the hobbies I had abandoned during decades of child rearing. The possibilities felt endless. 28 years I had spent trying to buy her love. Tonight, I learned you can't purchase respect. Some people only understand consequences. The house was quiet, filled with the familiar, comforting sounds of home. These were the sounds of peace, of a life free from drama and disappointment. I looked toward the window, at the quiet, sleeping street outside. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter, one focused on a man who had finally earned the right to live for himself. In life, there is a profound difference between giving and sacrificing. Giving comes from a place of abundance and love, while sacrifice often comes from a place of fear, fear of loss, fear of not being enough. Arthur's story is a powerful reminder that the greatest gift a parent can give is not endless provision, but the wisdom to build their own character. True family is not defined by blood, nor is it forged in wealth. It is built on a foundation of mutual respect. When that foundation is shattered, we must have the courage to walk away, not as an act of revenge, but as an act of profound self-respect. Arthur's journey from a heartbroken father in a lonely corner of a lavish party to a man at peace in his own home shows us that it is never too late to reclaim our own lives. The quiet closing of a door can sometimes be the loudest declaration of our own worth. He didn't lose a daughter, he found himself. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the importance of self-respect, please share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss another story that matters.